David took one last look at his wife and his children busy in the kitchen. He smiled to himself as he turned and closed the door. He was totally unaware of the horrors that waited for him. Viewer discretion is advised, as I talk about murder and sexual assault. Here is the story. Before we start, I need to give you some information, as times and attitudes were different back then. Ardwick, like Angel Meadow, was one of the poorest and run-down areas in Manchester, and the houses in the areas the story takes place were mostly abandoned and many were already demolished, leaving piles of rubble and wasteland to make way for the extension of the railway line. In the poorest areas, children had to help the family survive. They had to work long hours doing dangerous jobs from young ages. Some children lived on the street as their family couldn't look after them, or the family had died to violence or disease. They also had to deal with daily beatings from strangers, as this was legal, and poor living conditions contributed to stress and alcohol addiction, which led to abuse in the hands of their own parents. Early in the morning of the 11th of April 1905, David walked out of the room, but just before he closed the door, he looked back and took one last look at his wife, Mrs. Shields, and his two children playing on the floor. He could hear movement in the other rooms. The others must be up, he thought. John and his family were so poor they had to share the house with other families. But still, despite this, looking at his family, he smiled to himself, and he closed the door. Walking down the dirty cobbled street, he saw his friend, John Harris, waiting for him on the street corner. The two men shook hands, greeted each other, and set off about their work. As the two men made their living as rag and bone men. Rag and bone men were people who typically lived in extreme poverty and went from street to street collecting unwanted household items. But mostly they looked for things to sell on to merchants, like scraps of cloth, paper to make cardboard, broken glass to be melted down and reused, dead dogs and cats for their skins. Anything and everything had value. Usually the two men had a handcart, but lately it broke and there was no money to fix it. So Mr. Shields and Mr. Harris walked the streets with their dirty sacks thrown over their shoulders. After scouring the waste-filled gutters and cobbled roads, the men hadn't found very much in the way of unwanted items, so they decided to find a new spot, in hope of finding something of value. So at 3 p.m. in the afternoon, David and John went round the back alleys, and after making their way along the backs of Hoyle Street in Ardwick, an area of Manchester, they came across some abandoned houses. As they made their way through the rubbish and sludge that clung to their tattered shoes, David noticed the back door of number 24 partly open. He looked around him and he made his way towards the door. John noticed the door too and followed David. The men knew there was little chance of a great find, as all of the houses on the street had been abandoned for some time. Now, in the flagged yard, as David put his hand on the door, he looked down to his left and saw an old calico sack and part of a wooden crate propped up against the wall. The two men could see there was a hole in the wall, and it went down into the cellar. John grabbed the sack and crate and moved them to one side, as David kneeled down and looked into the darkness of the cellar. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light below him, he slowly began to make out the form of a body, lying sprawled out across the floor. David and John took the body to be that of a vagrant, who had either died during the weather or disease. So hoping that their luck had now changed and the man's body had something of value upon it, David squeezed through the hole, with John staying outside to help him back out. David made his way over to the body, but as he got near, he jumped back, covering his mouth with his hand. He was horrified to see this wasn't a man at all. In panic, David scrambled up the brick wall, tugging at John, screaming, "Get me out, man!" Both men took to their heels and ran straight to Fairfield police station. A short time later, Police Constable Robert Jackson, Mr. Shields and Mr. Harris made their way back to the house, with the rag and bone men talking frantically as they went, trying to describe what they found in the cellar. Upon re-entering the backyard of the abandoned house, David pushed forward, pointing to the opening in the wall down to the cellar. Taking off his hat, PC Robert climbed down through the hole into the darkness. At first, he saw nothing while his eyes adjusted to the darkness. Then, a few feet away, he noticed a partially clothed body, feet outstretched towards him, and the body's head was covered by a stone slab. PC Robert pulled out a handkerchief and held it to his nose and mouth. The body had been there for quite some time. Slowly, he took a step forward, and with both hands, he pulled back the stone slab. He let out a sigh of disbelief. Shocked by what he had seen, Police Constable Robert Jackson sent for backup, this being Detective Home, Detective Sergeant Bloomfield and Superintendent Corden, and the police coroner, Dr. Helsop. On arrival, they forced the door to the house open and walked the debris across the wooden floorboards. They had to smash the lock off the cellar door, and then they went down the stone cellar steps. Here, Dr. Helsop put down his bag and looked at the body. He noticed the body was gagged with a red handkerchief. He bent down, untied and removed the handkerchief, and soon discovered there was paper stuffed in the mouth. Pages of a comic called Funny Cuts, which was a supplement of a smaller 24-page newspaper that went inside the World comic, and it was dated the 8th of April 1905. There was also bruising across the body, with a boot impression on the stomach. Dr. Helsop discovered inside one of the pockets a hook, and a similar one was found next to the body, which later was discovered to be tools used by the victim at his place of work. Dr. Helsop said he had seen everything that can be seen in such dim light, and then had the body transferred to Fairfield Street Mortuary, where he would perform the post-mortem and run a few other tests. On Wednesday morning the 12th of April, on Wood Street in Chorlton-cum-on-Medlock, Mrs. Smith closed the door behind her as she left her house. She looked up and down the street. She was still concerned about her son, Thomas. He had gone to work at Greenhalgh and Hackleston's works, near Bridgewater Street, and she had not heard from him. Thomas failed to return home and had been missing for days. At first, she thought he might have travelled over to Denton or Duckingfield to visit either one of his sisters, but her inquiries were fruitless. So Mrs. Smith sent her eldest son, 30-year-old Isaac, to the local police station, where Thomas was officially reported as missing. Although it wasn't totally strange, as he would find extra work where he could, but it did make her worry with him being missing for so long. But she told herself he was fine. She straightened her clothes and she walked down the street to work at her brother-in-law's house over in Old Trafford, to work as a cleaner. While she was cleaning out the fireplace, her sister's husband began reading aloud the grim news from one of the morning's newspapers, stating the body of a boy had been found. And then he read the description of the deceased. Around 15-16 years of age, 5 feet in height, long brown hair, grey eyes, fresh complexion, dressed in a black jacket, a black vest, dark grey trousers with a black stripe, blue and red striped cotton shirt with 2 black stockings and clasped clogs. At this, she dropped the brush and went pale. She realised the victim could well be her son. She jumped up and ran, making her way back home, meeting her son Isaac and 2 friends. Miss Smith made her way to the mortuary, where they would identify the body. However, the viewing had a massive impact on her. As the boy's head had been battered to such an extent, they could only identify the body from the clothes he wore, as they matched those of the day of Thomas's disappearance. And sadly, she confirmed this was her son, Thomas. The papers of the time jumped on this story, describing in detail the victim's injuries and, surprisingly, a brief description of the murderer. This lit a fuse, and the newspapers across the country from London to Dublin ran with Jack the Ripper comparisons from the brutal murders that took place 17 years prior in the now famous Whitechapel in London. Now, with national press covering the story, the pressure was on to find the killer. And over the next few weeks, police officers led by Detective Sergeant Bloomfield and Detective Home searched every house in the nearby neighbourhood, as well as those that had been left abandoned and empty. And in doing so, they interviewed hundreds of people, hoping that somebody saw or knew something that could give some more information on the crime. And police discovered similar stories, like one employer told them of one of his boys who had taken time away to do an errand for his parents. Halfway home, he met a man who offered him a penny to follow him, but as they drew close to an abandoned house, the young lad turned and ran. He gave a detailed description of the stranger to the police, but this was a dead end. Another story that interested the police was a year earlier. Two different boys at two separate times had been enticed into abandoned houses in the same neighbourhood, which was later discovered as crimes already reported. But this information stood out to the officers. As in the attack, the stranger made an attempt to gag one of the boys with a handkerchief. This made the boy scream so loud people came running, but unfortunately the assailant managed to get away. Again, a detailed description was given to the police, but once again, the police were unable to make an arrest. So when the inquest into Thomas Smith's murder started on Friday the 5th of May 1905, it appeared Thomas wasn't the first attack, at least the third, putting even more pressure on the police. During the inquest, Dr. Helsop took the stand and gave details of the injuries sustained by Thomas. Mrs. Smith had to be removed from the room. She became inconsolable. Dr. Helsop included how he found the comic forced into the boy's mouth after removing the red handkerchief. He also said the boy's clothing was torn and disarranged. The boy's trousers were torn apart at the front and pulled down at the back. Bruising around the head and body made him certain it was a walking stick with a heavy metal handle that was used as a weapon. Dr. Helsop said it was clear the boy fought back hard, and that the crime didn't occur in the cellar. The body was placed there after the murder. The Ripper rumours were only inflamed when Dr. Helsop informed the room that Thomas had also sustained horrendous mutilations to the lower region of his body with animalistic ferocity. But despite hours upon hours of police time and resources being used, no definitive information or evidence could be put before the jury as to who the murderer was. The jury therefore quickly returned with a verdict of willful murder against some person or persons unknown. The investigation into the murder of Thomas Smith would continue, and the press ran with the story for months. Time would pass and things started to quiet down, but 19 months later, on Tuesday the 20th of November 1906, William Hulse, a labourer employed to help with the demolition of a row of 8 abandoned houses on Chapel Street in Ancoats, Manchester, discovered a dreadful scene. After checking the last few houses, William entered number 6 Chapel Street and started upstairs. Went from room to room, checking everything was okay and there was no one hiding or living in the buildings. But having looked around the property, he made his way down into the cellar. With no windows or lights, the cellar was in complete darkness. He lit a small lamp and continued down the stairs into the cellar. As he walked, he was hit with a foul smell. He knew it wasn't the damp. He took another step and stumbled over something on the floor. Lowering his lamp downwards, he was met with the sight of mostly skeletal remains. Hulse ran out of the cellar and into another labourer that he'd been working with, and together they ran for help. Police Constable John Crowther arrived back with the labourers and began an investigation. Other officers arrived and began to prepare the body ready to move to the mortuary. It soon became apparent that the body was so decomposed that it had to be placed into a bag before being carried out and taken away. The news of the body spread through Ancoats, and it was discovered the boy was 15-year-old Squire Naston, whose widowed mother lived on Davy Street, Ancoats. Police went straight to her house and knocked on the door, but she said they had not spoken or seen each other since August, as she had had enough of him. He caused her nothing but trouble. He had set the house on fire, often stole money from her, as well as taking items from the home to pawn without her knowledge. Police actually quoted her saying that he had never been a particularly good lad. The police knew straight away that the crimes were linked, with one police constable saying, detail by detail, they are exactly the same. Ultimately, Dr. Helsop could not conclude what caused the death due to the advanced state of decomposition, but a handkerchief was found tied double around the boy's neck. And it seemed to Dr. Helsop that both cases had remarkable parallels. Both victims were young boys of a similar age, and both had been found in abandoned houses in cellars. Both were stripped from the waist down and seemingly outraged. The only difference between the two boys was that Thomas Smith was brutally beaten around the head and face, where there was no evidence that the same had happened to Squire Naston. With the new interest in the case, police found reports. One in particular took place within walking distance of Hoyle Street and Chapel Street, the scenes of both the murders. A boy by the name of John Edward went missing on the 2nd of December 1905, and described as good looking, with grey eyes, brown hair and a fresh complexion. When he left home he was wearing a brown overcoat, corduroy trousers, grey jacket and laced boots. What was striking about this case though was the boy's age. He was 15 years old, around the same age as both Thomas Smith and Squire Naston. And the second report that got the police attention, young Richard Burke, aged 7 years old when he vanished at London Road Station. The Manchester Evening News dated it as Tuesday the 5th of December 1905 and ran a small article describing the boy as being 4 foot high with fair complexion, blue eyes, and he was dressed in a navy blue shirt, laced clogs and a grey cap. The police believe these are all the victims of the same attacker, and that would put the number at 6 different boys attacked. Although they had very little evidence and no real witnesses, police had described the murder in a telegram as similar to Jack the Ripper. Interestingly, on the 28th of August, a 35-year-old labourer was seen talking with the boy in the passageway of Hoyle Street. The boy started shouting and screaming, and a crowd of locals grabbed the man and held him till the police arrived. When interviewed, the boy said the man known as John Leonard had a razor and wanted the boy to go into an abandoned house with him, and had threatened to use the razor on him if he resisted. When investigating, the police did find a razor on the floor of the passageway. John Leonard was held overnight, but there was no other evidence to link him with the other crimes, so he was charged with acting suspiciously and released on the 29th. But some of the public and press believed John Leonard was the attacker, and his arrest was reported in the papers, such as the Lancashire Evening Post on Tuesday the 29th of August 1905. And if John Leonard was the attacker, that would mean he attacked 7 boys we know of, with 3 escaping, but sadly this would also mean Squire Naston wouldn't have been murdered, and potentially John Edward and Richard Burke wouldn't have gone missing either if he had been arrested on the 28th of August. Thomas Smith's funeral took place on the 17th of April 1905, and his body would be interred within the grounds of Southern Cemetery. Squire Naston, his body would be interred within the grounds of Phillips Park Cemetery. The bodies of Richard and John were never found, and just like Jack the Ripper, no one was ever charged with these crimes. Police of the time had said that they were working on the theory that the crimes were committed by a semi-lunatic. Well, that will do it. It's a bit of a dark story this week, I know, but let me know your thoughts. Do you think it was John Leonard? Or someone else altogether? Or do you think these crimes were not even related? Also, if you're new here, don't forget to like and subscribe, I post true stories like this every Wednesday and stories about what lies underneath your feet when walking around Manchester on Sundays. Thank you for your support and take care.